Some wounds don't bleed. They echo through your choices, through your relationships, through your silence. We live our lives believing we're chasing dreams, success, love, yet most of us are running from something much deeper, something silent and hidden. A child. The child you once were, the one who was never held enough, the one who wasn't seen, the one who learned to survive by becoming someone else. But what if healing didn't require a lifetime? What if it began with just 5 words? 5 truths whispered not to the adult you've become, but to the child still waiting within. Today, we won't speak to your ego. We will speak to your soul, because healing doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the forgotten places. The inner child is still there, and today, that child will hear what they've waited for their whole life. You is not just a pronoun. It is the cry of identity trying to emerge from the rubble of forgotten years. It is the spark of consciousness that first awakens in the child's mind and begins asking, "Who am I?" Long before we can speak, long before we can understand the world, we are absorbing its judgments, its fears, its projections. We learn what we are allowed to be by what we are punished for expressing. And so the word you begins as something fragile, uncertain, shaped by the reflections in others' eyes. For many, the earliest mirror is cracked, and the self they see is not themselves, but a distorted image painted by wounded parents, distant caretakers, or a culture that only loves what conforms. You, in this context, is not a celebration of self. It is a haunting question. When a child is told they are too loud, too emotional, too sensitive, too much or not enough, they internalize the belief that you is wrong. The self becomes a liability, and so the child begins to split. One self is hidden away, the true, instinctive, emotional core. The other self becomes the mask, obedient, pleasing, invisible when necessary. This is how the authentic self is exiled and the false self becomes the actor, performing a life, but the soul never forgets. The inner child, locked behind decades of adaptation, still holds the memory of the original you, wild, innocent, open, and whole. To say you in this healing context is to call back that original self from the shadows. It is an invocation. It is a return, not to who others told you to be, but to who you were before the world interfered. You is the gateway to ownership. It demands that we stop living as side characters in someone else's story and take responsibility for the narrative of our lives. And yet, responsibility does not mean blame. It means reclaiming. It means remembering that while others may have hurt you, only you can bring the pieces back together. But this kind of self-return is not intellectual. It is not simply saying the words, it is an embodied reckoning. It is the quiet realization, often through tears, that the one you abandoned all those years ago, the scared child within, is still waiting. And that child does not want to be fixed. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be heard. They want someone to finally say, you didn't deserve what happened to you. You mattered then, and you matter now. Many people chase healing by seeking outside approval, achievements, or spiritual bypasses. But nothing will ever replace the moment when you turn inward and speak to your own soul with compassion. When you stop running. When you sit with the pain long enough to realize that it's not here to destroy you. It's here to lead you back. The self, after all, is not a static concept. It is a process, a becoming. And this process begins the moment you stop avoiding the word you. Most of our suffering comes from the fact that we live our lives based on who we were taught to be, not who we truly are. And so, we feel an existential emptiness, a hollowness that success, love, or even therapy can't fill, until we finally ask, who is the you I've never dared to meet? The soul does not demand perfection, it demands truth. To heal, we must retrieve the parts of us that we abandoned for survival. And the first step in that retrieval is calling ourselves home. By name, not the name given by society, not the labels assigned to our behaviors, but the deeper name, the one only the soul knows. That name begins with you. It is you who must walk back into the memories. You who must feel what was unfelt. You, who must stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to exist. You who must finally declare without apology, I am here. I was always here. And I will no longer abandon myself to make others comfortable. You is not a whisper. It is a revolution. Because the moment you remember who you truly are, the illusion breaks. The spell of generational shame, of familial silence, of inherited self-hate ends. The child within hears your voice and begins to trust again, begins to believe that maybe, just maybe, they are finally safe to come home. Were is not merely a word tied to the past. It is a threshold, a sacred reminder that time, though linear to the conscious mind, holds healing potential for the psyche. To say were is to acknowledge that your suffering existed, that it was real, but it no longer defines the totality of your being. It holds space for your former pain without chaining you to it. It tells the inner child softly and without judgment that the version of them who carried unbearable weight did so to survive. But survival is not the end of the journey. It is only the beginning. In the language of the soul, were whispers. What happened was not your fault, but it shaped you. Yet what shaped you can be reshaped. You were the child who waited in silence for love that never came. You were the one who absorbed your parents' brokenness as proof of your unworthiness. You were the frightened one who mistook chaos for love and rejection for justice. But here's the hidden grace in that single word. You were, not you are. The moment you speak it consciously, with full awareness, is the moment you step out of the trance of identification. Children don't have the luxury of perspective. When they are wounded, neglected, or unseen, they don't think, this is about my parents' unresolved trauma. They think, this must be about me. The child mind fuses self and world, shame and identity, pain and permanence, and so the pain becomes fused into the fabric of the self. I am bad. I am not enough. I am unlovable. These aren't thoughts. They are the unconscious mantras that form the ego's foundation. And the ego will do anything to protect that structure, even if it means clinging to suffering as truth. That is why were is such a radical word in the healing process. It cracks open the illusion of permanence. It calls into question the entire architecture of false identity that was constructed around childhood wounds. When you speak the word were, you place a boundary between the past and the present. You invite in the idea that change is not only possible, it is inevitable. That the self is not a fixed entity, but a becoming. That you are not trapped in the patterns you inherited. That trauma is not a life sentence. In depth psychology, we do not heal by erasing the past. We heal by integrating it. We go back, not to get stuck there, but to bring light into the darkness that still governs us unconsciously. The psyche, like a labyrinth, hides its most powerful truths in the very places we fear to look. Were is the lantern. It is the symbol of your capacity to re-enter old memories without being consumed by them, to touch them with compassion, to see the pain not through the lens of helplessness, but through the eyes of wisdom. You were the child who didn't understand why love was conditional. You were the one who held in tears because crying made things worse. You were the one who learned that being small, silent, and pleasing was safer than being real. And because you were that child, you developed certain beliefs, certain emotional reflexes, certain coping mechanisms that followed you into adulthood. They didn't follow you because you were broken. They followed you because you were brilliant. The psyche adapts to pain in order to protect the self from annihilation. What we call wounds were once intelligent survival strategies. But now you are not that helpless child. You are not confined to those early choices. You are no longer at the mercy of those who didn't see you. This is the sacred pivot that were introduces. It gives you the power of differentiation, the ability to say, that was me then, this is me now. It gives the adult self the voice that the child never had, and it gives the inner child the safety they never felt. The relationship between the adult self and the inner child becomes the site of redemption. And that redemption begins the moment you say, I were, but I am no longer. Many people fear looking at the past because they think it will overwhelm them. But the truth is, what overwhelms us is not the past itself. It's the unprocessed pain that still lives inside us because we've never returned to it consciously. Gives you permission to turn around and look, to walk back into the memory not as a victim but as a witness, a guide, a protector. To sit beside the younger version of yourself in their darkest moment and say, "You are not alone anymore. I see you now, and I'm not going anywhere." This is not just poetic language. It is the architecture of transformation. The psyche does not respond to denial. It responds to presence. It responds to truth. And truth is, you were hurt. You were misunderstood. You were left to carry burdens too heavy for a child. But truth is also, you are no longer bound by those realities. The psyche is not static. It is a river. And once we stop damming it with denial and repression, it begins to flow again, toward wholeness, toward integration, toward the self. The word "were" holds grief, but it also holds grace, because implicit in it is the recognition that change has occurred, that the present is not identical to the past, and that means the future is not doomed to repeat it. This is where generational healing begins, not in blaming those who came before, but in acknowledging that their pain was passed to you. And now, with consciousness, you can stop it from going any further. You can say, "It ends here, with me." That declaration is not made in rage. It is made in reverence, for the self who suffered, for the ancestors who didn't know better, for the children you might one day raise with the truth of love rather than the shadow of pain. To live in the eternal present of your trauma is to remain unconscious. To use the word "were" is to step out of the fog of identification and into the clarity of healing. It allows you to write a new story, not by denying the old one, but by putting it in its proper place. The past is a teacher, not a master. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become in response to it. And the first step in becoming is seeing clearly where you came from. You were. That phrase is your compass. It points both backward and forward. It honors the child while empowering the adult. It makes grief sacred and growth possible. It is the bridge between survival and self-realization, between darkness and individuation, between forgetting and remembering who you truly are. Never is a word of finality, and when spoken in the context of healing, it slices through the soul with the sharpness of a forgotten truth. It is not a soft word. It does not ask for permission. It declares, it is a sword that cuts the psychic thread binding a person to their inherited shame. When you say never, what you are truly doing is revisiting the most fragile parts of yourself and standing guard over them, declaring that the burdens they carried, the blame they absorbed, the guilt that shaped them, were never meant to be theirs. Never is the line between illusion and reality. It is the force that rescues the child within from the lie they were forced to live. The child who grows up in dysfunction does not possess the tools of discernment. They do not understand projection, unconscious complexes, or inherited trauma. They don't understand that a parent's coldness is rooted in their own unresolved wounds, or that rejection often has more to do with the emotional illiteracy of the adult than the worth of the child. All the child knows is that pain is happening, and when pain enters a space that is supposed to be safe, the child cannot help but believe that they are the cause of it. That belief calcifies into identity. It is no longer something bad happened, it becomes I am bad. And so the self fractures. The child who could have flourished learns instead to shrink, to adapt, to become lovable through perfection or invisibility. They begin to live in a world where love is earned through self-betrayal. Never is the rebellion against that unconscious agreement. It is the psychic revolt of the soul awakening to its own worth. It is the voice that echoes down the hallways of time, finding the young self huddled in confusion, whispering, "You were never the reason they left. You were never the reason they yelled. You were never too much. You were never not enough." To speak never with awareness is to finally reject the belief that you were born defective, and to recognize that what happened to you was a reflection of others' pain. not your identity. So many adults walk through life acting out the roles they unconsciously adopted in childhood: the pleaser, the rescuer, the overachiever, the invisible one. They strive to be good enough, kind enough, smart enough, perfect enough, all in a desperate attempt to escape the gnawing sense of unworthiness that was never theirs to begin with. This is what intergenerational trauma does. It teaches the child to carry the emotional debris of the parent. It convinces them that love must be earned, that authenticity is dangerous, that the truth of who they are is too much to be accepted. But there comes a point in the soul's journey where something deeper begins to stir, a whisper in the dark, a soft inner rebellion. The mask begins to crack. The person begins to tire, not just physically, but existentially. Tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of betraying the self for connection. And in that fatigue, something miraculous can emerge: the first conscious never, the first moment of refusal, the first time the person says, "This shame is not mine. This story is not mine. This guilt does not belong to me." It is not enough to think this intellectually. The psyche must feel it. The body must release it. The soul must reclaim it. Never is not a rational conclusion. It is a spiritual rupture. It is the collapse of the lie that you were the problem. It is the dismantling of the identity constructed around another person's inability to love you properly. And when that lie breaks, what floods in is grief, not just for what happened, but for how long you believed it was your fault. Grief is a sacred element in the process of individuation. It is the alchemical fire that burns away the false self, and never is what ignites it. It allows you to go back to those memories, not to relive them, but to rewrite their meaning. The child who once sat in silence interpreting emotional abandonment as evidence of being unlovable now sees clearly: I was not unloved. I was unseen. I was not unworthy. I was misunderstood. I was not the cause. I was the consequence of another's inner war. And that changes everything. This reframing does not blame, it clarifies. It separates the self from the distortion. It allows you to feel compassion for your caregivers without confusing compassion with continued self-sacrifice. You can love them and still say, "Never again." You can see their pain and still protect yourself from it. The soul is not asking for revenge. It is asking for restoration, for truth, for a return to innocence, not naivety, but the original innocence of being enough, exactly as you are, without conditions or performance. There is a deep psychological necessity in reclaiming the never, because without it, the unconscious mind continues to reenact the same old wounds in new relationships. You will seek out people who confirm the original belief that you are not enough. You will chase approval the way a starving person chases bread. You will fear authenticity because being fully seen once brought you pain. But when you say never with full presence, those patterns begin to dissolve. You begin to see that you are not broken. You are breaking free. In the great mythological journey of the self, every hero must face the past. Every soul must descend into the underworld of memory, of pain, of silence. And in that descent, they must retrieve the piece of themselves that was lost. The key to that retrieval is not more doing, more proving, more effort. The key is truth. And truth is this: you were never the reason for their anger, their withdrawal, their coldness, their chaos. You were a child, and children are never to blame. When you embrace this truth, not just in your mind, but in your heart and body, you begin to stand taller, not in arrogance, but in rootedness. You become sovereign. The inner child begins to trust you, to feel safe in your presence. And once the child within feels safe, the adult self is finally free to live fully, not from fear, not from wounded scripts, but from authenticity. That is the beginning of real transformation, the end of the false self, the emergence of the true one. Never is not just a word. It is the veil lifting. It is the moment. The psyche says, I refuse to carry what was never mine. I refuse to wear the shame that was handed to me. I refuse to live in a cage built by misunderstanding. I choose liberation, I choose self. I choose to believe, perhaps for the first time, that I was innocent, that I was worthy, that I was lovable all along. And in that choice, the generational wound begins to close. The pain is no longer passed down, it is held, seen, felt, and finally released. The curse breaks. And the child within, no longer silenced, finally hears the truth they've waited for all their life. You were never the problem. Meant is the word of destiny, of design, of deeper order. It is not a casual term. It belongs to the realm of meaning. And when spoken in the process of inner child healing, it does not simply point to what was supposed to happen. It opens the question of what was never supposed to happen, and what suffering emerged from being torn away from the soul's natural unfolding. Meant evokes what could have been, what should have been, if love had not been distorted, if innocence had not been interrupted, if the child had been seen not as an extension or burden, but as a soul becoming. To say meant is to stand in the ruins of a misdirected life and feel the ache of recognition. I was meant to be cherished, not criticized. I was meant to be protected, not punished. I was meant to be encouraged, not compared. I was meant to trust, to play, to express, to unfold in the safety of presence and patience. And yet, that did not happen. Instead, you were molded by expectations that had nothing to do with your nature. Instead, you learned to contort yourself into the shapes that kept you acceptable, invisible, or manageable. The world did not meet you with reverence but with demand, and slowly the one you were meant to be disappeared under the weight of survival. The psyche grieves not only for what happened but for what never happened, for the guidance that never arrived, for the warmth that never stayed, for the truth that was never spoken. And beneath that grief lies the blueprint of the true self, the self that was meant to become. It waits patiently in the unconscious, in dreams, in symptoms, in longings. It calls through the silence, begging to be remembered. That calling is not madness, it is the voice of the soul trying to reassemble what was scattered. The inner child carries the memory of this blueprint, even after decades of abandonment, even after layers of masking and adaptation. That original design never vanishes. It hides in the shadows, watching, waiting for an invitation. And that invitation begins with a whisper. What if I was never meant to feel this way? That single question breaks the spell of normalizing dysfunction. It opens a crack in the conditioned mind. It allows the soul to seep through. You were meant to feel safe in your own skin. You were meant to express without punishment. You were meant to ask questions without shame. You were meant to love without fear of betrayal. You were meant to be held not just physically but emotionally, to be witnessed in your joy and in your pain without being judged or silenced. When that doesn't happen, something inside the child breaks, not beyond repair but beyond recognition. The healing journey is not about becoming something new. It is about uncovering what was always there, buried beneath the compromises. This is why the word meant is sacred. It points toward the original innocence, the sacred template of the soul that predates trauma. You were meant to unfold like a flower in the sun. And when that sun was absent, you turned inward. You shut down. You curled your petals tight and waited for light. But time alone does not heal. Presence does. And now, it is you who must become the light you were meant to receive. It is you who must approach the inner child with the warmth and patience they were denied. It is you who must say, you were always meant to be loved like this. In depth psychology, we know that the symptoms you experience today, anxiety, depression, relationship dysfunction, addiction, are not random. They are signals. They are messengers. They are the psyche's way of saying something essential was missed. Something core was interrupted. Healing begins when we stop trying to silence the symptoms and instead ask what they are trying to restore. Often they are trying to bring us back to the self we were meant to be. This meant self is not an idealized version. It is not perfect. It is not without scars, but it is real. It is whole. It is rooted in authenticity, and it holds the wisdom of all that was endured. The pain did not erase this self. It refined it. But it must be reclaimed. It must be consciously chosen. You must look at all the ways you became what others needed you to be, and gently undo them. You must strip away the performance. You must stop asking, who do they want me to be, and begin asking, who was I before I learned to hide? The child within does not need to become someone else. They need to be met in the pain, met in the confusion, met in the longing, and told, you were meant to be free. You were meant to feel joy. You were meant to create, to explore, to trust. That is not sentimental. It is the foundation of psychological wholeness. A child whose basic emotional needs are not met does not simply move on. They split. They fracture. They carry the unmet need as a haunting presence into every adult relationship, into every act of self-sabotage, into every unspoken fear that they are too much or not enough. But here's the power of the psyche. It remembers. Not only the pain, but the possibility. You remember what you were meant for. You remember what being whole felt like, even if only for a moment. And that memory is sacred. That is the memory you must protect. That is the memory you must water with truth. You were not meant to betray yourself for love. You were not meant to earn affection by disappearing. You were not meant to live someone else's unlived life. The journey back to the self is not a straight path, it is a spiral. Again and again you will return to the places of pain, but each time with more wisdom, more compassion, more clarity. You will remember what was lost, and in remembering you will reclaim it. That is how the true self returns, not with fanfare but with tenderness, not in perfection, but in presence. When you say meant with your whole being, you are not indulging fantasy. You are honoring truth. You are acknowledging that something sacred was missed, and that you are now choosing to restore it. You are becoming the parent, the guide, the mirror that the child within never had. You are giving them back what was stolen, not with blame, but with devotion. This is the alchemy of healing, turning grief into meaning, turning pain into presence, turning what was into what is, through the recognition of what was always meant to be. And once you begin this process, you no longer live as a victim of your past. You live as the architect of your future, not because you control everything, but because you are finally living in alignment with your essence. You were meant to know peace. You were meant to feel at home in yourself. You were meant to speak your truth without fear. You were meant to love without self-abandonment. You were meant to wake up in a world that reflected your worth, not questioned it. And even if that was not your beginning, it can still be your return. Because the soul does not forget. The soul is always pointing you home. And meant is the signpost that reminds you, home is not a place. It is a self, fully remembered. Loved is the most powerful word in the emotional lexicon of the soul. It is the one every child longs to hear, to feel, to trust. Not love as performance or transaction, not love as a reward for obedience, but love as a state of being, love as presence, love as the quiet, unwavering gaze that says, you are safe here because you exist. To say loved, in the process of inner child healing, is to touch the very center of what was broken, and offer it the one medicine it was always seeking, not explanation, not logic, but connection. The child does not crave perfection in their caregivers. What the child craves is attunement, to be seen in their joy and not overshadowed, to be seen in their sadness and not dismissed, to be allowed, to unfold in their unique rhythm without being forced into the mold of another's insecurity. The soul of the child grows when it is mirrored, accurately, empathetically, consistently. But when that mirroring is distorted, when the child is told they are too sensitive, too wild, too loud, too much, they begin to fracture. They begin to question the core of who they are. They begin to believe that love is conditional, and therefore so is their worth. This is where the wound begins. The deepest psychic pain is not the absence of love, but the misrepresentation of love. Love that hurts, love that abandons, love that manipulates, love that silences, love that demands. You become someone else in order to receive it. When this false love is internalized, the child loses access to their authentic self. They begin to shape themselves in the image of what pleases the other. They learn to abandon themselves in order to keep attachment. And so begins a lifetime of confusion between love and fear, love and control, love and performance. But the soul never forgets what real love feels like. Even if it was only glimpsed once, even if it came from a teacher, a stranger, a book, a moment in nature, the psyche stores that memory, that spark, that taste of truth. That is the compass. That is the inner whisper that says, something was missing. That whisper is not weakness, it is the beginning of awakening. To realize later in life that you were not loved in the way your soul needed is a devastation, but it is also the doorway to freedom, because what you can see, you can heal. What you can name, you can reclaim. Love must be redefined. It must be reclaimed from the ruins of confusion and brought back into the light. You were always worthy of love, not for what you did, but for who you were. You were lovable before you performed, before you perfected, before you disappeared to make others comfortable. This realization is not a one-time moment. It is a sacred remembering that must be practiced daily. You return to the inner child and say again and again you were loved even when they couldn't show it. You are loved now without needing to prove it. This repetition is not indulgent. It is rewiring, it is reparenting. It is building the internal scaffolding of safety that should have been there from the start. The adult self must become the one who holds the child self with unwavering devotion. Not with pity, not with impatience, but with reverence. To love your inner child is to learn how to sit in your own discomfort without flinching, to speak to yourself in the tone that soothes, not shames, to become the safe haven you were always searching for. And in doing so, you begin to untangle the false beliefs that love must be earned, that love is dangerous, that love will always leave. When you touch the truth of being loved, not as a reward, but as a right, the defenses begin to soften. The hardened parts of you, the hyper-independence, the distrust, the avoidance begin to feel less necessary. Because what were they really but strategies to protect you from the unbearable pain of not being seen? The walls you built were brilliant, they kept you alive, but they also kept love out, and now you have the awareness to choose differently. This is not about seeking love from the outside. That comes later. That comes naturally. First, it is about cultivating love within, the kind that witnesses you without agenda, the kind that forgives you for not knowing better, the kind that holds space for all the versions of you that tried to survive. This inner love is not abstract, it is felt. It is earned through presence, through showing up for yourself again and again, especially when the old wounds rise. In this act of self-love, the generational cycle breaks, because the unloved child often becomes the emotionally unavailable adult, and the cycle continues. But when that adult pauses, turns inward, and chooses to meet the unmet needs of their younger self, something radical happens. The chain is disrupted. The pain is transmuted, and a new legacy is born, one rooted not in shame but in compassion. To feel loved is not to be perfect, it is to be accepted, not just for your strengths, but for your wounds, for your fears, for your shadow. True love includes the parts of you that feel unlovable, and that kind of love begins with you, with how you speak to yourself in the silence, with how you hold yourself in the storm, with how you stay when the old instinct is to flee. You were always meant to be loved like this, and the tragedy is not that you weren't, but that you believed it was because of you. Healing is the return to the truth. You were never the problem. You were never too much. You were never unworthy. You were simply waiting to be met in the way your soul needed. Now, you can be that meeting. Now, you can give the love that was withheld. Now, you can stop searching and start becoming. This is not easy work. It is not fast, but it is holy. Because to love the inner child is to love the world through different eyes. You become less reactive, more present, less fearful, more open, less hardened, more whole. And from this wholeness, everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become more real, more grounded, more capable of receiving the love you always deserved. In the end, to be loved is not just to feel good. It is to feel real. It is to come home to yourself. It is to wake up each day and know deep in your bones that your worth is not up for debate, that your value is not tied to your productivity, your appearance, your compliance. It is intrinsic, eternal, unshakable. This is the final truth the inner child waits to hear, not from the past, but from you. You were always loved. You are still loved. And now, finally, you can love yourself in the way you always needed, not just to heal, but to live, fully, freely, fiercely. If you only remember one thing from this speech, let it be this: you were never the problem. These 5 words are not just affirmation, they are psychological truth. They dissolve the illusion that pain defines you. They call the inner child back home, and when that child feels safe, you become whole. You begin to feel free. Free to choose love over fear. Free to stop performing for worth. Free to break the chain. Free to begin again. Not as a reaction, but as a creation. You were never the problem. Say it again. Say it until that forgotten child inside you finally believes it. Because once they do, generational pain ends with you, and a new world begins.